Today we're going to talk about characteristics of all living things. How do we tell the difference between something that is not alive and something that is alive? So, first thing is that there is always a clear boundary between living things and non-living things, whether we're talking about a cell and its membrane clearly separating inside from outside, or our skin, which separates us from the outside world as well. If that boundary, the cell membrane or the skin, is not intact, we can handle wounds and we can fix those. But if we lose it and it's not effective anymore, then we're not alive. All living things are made of cells and their products. Your whole body is made of cells. Your hair is a cell product. And even all of the activities or actions that are done by living things are done by cells, which means that your feelings and your thoughts are actually done by your cells, which I think is kind of mind-blowing. Now, if cells can only come from pre-existing cells, which is true, cells don't just appear out of nowhere in the air or emerge from the dirt. They have to come from a pre-existing cell through something called cell division, which we'll talk about soon. So because all cells come from pre-existing cells, that means that if we trace the history of our cells back, all living organisms can trace themselves back to a common ancestor, the last common ancestor that we all have. So that means we're all related, which is kind of cool. Now, because we're all related, that means we all use the same basic things. I mean, we're all made of cells, which I mentioned, but also we all use DNA and RNA. We all use proteins. We all use carbohydrates. We all use lipids. Now, granted, there are some differences that have occurred over time, but all the basic building blocks are the same because we're all related. We all came from that same cell. Now, those three things together are known as cell theory. So cell theory says that the cell is the most basic unit of life, that all living things are made of cells and their products, and that all of those cells come from pre-existing cells. Now, I want to pause a moment in talking about characteristics of life to talk about this word theory. So when we use the word theory in everyday language, we might be talking about a sleuth. Oh, sorry, Inspector Gadget. We might be talking about a, wacky sleuth that says, I have a theory about how this thing happened. And it can be totally crackpot. But in a scientific theory, what we're talking about is an explanation of an aspect of the natural world or the universe that's been repeatedly tested and validated using the scientific method. That means it's not one individual going, I think evolution. It's actually a huge group of scientists who agree to test things rigorously and report their results honestly. Anything that is considered an established scientific theory has been rigorously scrutinized and tested, and it actually embodies not just one or two pieces of information, but a whole bunch of scientific knowledge. Theories explain how or why something works, and therefore they are much bigger and more important in our scientific understanding than simply a fact or a law, which just describes a single thing. So where do theories themselves fit into the scientific method? So if I have a theory that all things are made of cells, for instance, then I might use that theory to make a prediction. So if I put this one cell into a broth with all the nutrients that it needs and wait a little bit, then it'll turn into two cells. That's my prediction. Now I'm going to design the experiment to test that. And after I do the experiment, I'm going to observe the results. And if it turned into two cells, then that actually supports my theory. all right, or supports the theory, and somebody else, some other scientist, is testing that theory in a different way. So this is how it all fits together. All right, let's go back to the characteristics of living things. Another thing that is true about all living things is that we all show development. Development actually encompasses two things: differentiation, which means to become specialized, to become different and distinct from other cells that came from that same population, and growth, which is just to get bigger. So here we can see the different kinds of cells that can differentiate from the original cell that we start with. Certainly we go from having cute little tiny feet to big grown-up feet, and we see differentiation and growth in, say, how a tadpole turns into a frog. So all of those are examples of development. All living animals also reproduce their own kind. Right? And the reason is that one individual cannot live forever, however much you might want to. Now, some organisms reproduce asexually. That means that the offspring are genetically identical to the parent. So here's our parent. Our parent decides that it wants to have company, starts growing a little branch here. That branch turns into a miniature version of the parent. They are genetically identical. And therefore, if something happens that would make this one sick, it's also going to make this one sick. They're going to have the same advantages and disadvantages. Humans and a lot of other species reproduce sexually. Now, sexual reproduction is when offspring are produced by mixing the genetic material from two parents. All right, that's going to introduce some diversity. Now, it seems complicated, and it is. So why do we reproduce sexually? The whole reason is to produce genetic diversity. The more similar, genetically similar, individuals in a species are, the more they share the same advantages and disadvantages. That means that if something wipes out one individual, something that happens in the environment, then it's likely to wipe out all of the members of the species, and you lose the population. However, when we have genetic diversity, that means that some individuals will have randomly traits that enable them to survive and reproduce, where others will not. But the species will go on, even though it kind of changes in its composition. So, if we wipe out, something changes in the environment that wipes out one individual, or people, those are not people, or individuals that share the same trait, then it means that there are going to be other individuals that don't have that trait and therefore will survive. Over many generations, this changes the genetic profile of the population, making it more suited to the environment, which is adaptation. This idea is a substantial part of the theory of evolution. Okay, so what do I mean by genetic profile? A genetic profile, if I did a genetic profile of you, then I would see all the genes, like eye color, this color, hair color, hair texture, all of that stuff. That would be your profile. When we look at the genetic profile of a population, then we're looking at, if we're using the example eye color, we're looking at the frequency of each different color of eyes. And so when a population adapts to a change in the environment, certain traits start to appear more frequently and some less frequently. And that's changing the overall profile of the population. So all living things evolve. In the example of finches' beaks, which is actually what Charles Darwin was observing that helped him to come up with this, the original theory of evolution, you have a population, let's say on an island, of birds that all have this shaped beak. But there are different food sources on the island, and at random, the offspring of one of these birds has a different shaped beak that enables it to eat fruit. Now, maybe the fruit is so plentiful that that really gives that individual an advantage, and so they reproduce, and that trait starts to show up in that population. Whereas this mutation that again happened at random allows this population of birds to eat insects instead of seeds. So it gives an advantage to those individuals. They're more likely to reproduce, and over time, it can actually result in separate species. But it's a split in the population as a new trait develops. Here's another example. You've probably all heard about antibiotic resistance. So antibiotic resistance is evolution. In this petri dish, we have a number of normal bacteria, the orange ones, and then we have one that, because of just a random mutation in its DNA, is somewhat more resistant to antibiotics. So now we add antibiotics to this dish or to the person who's infected, and the antibiotics kill all of the normal bacteria. But this single bacterium that is resistant is not dead yet. And as long as it's not too sick to make copies of itself, it will begin to multiply. And now we have an entire population that is resistant to antibiotics, which means that this population of bacteria has evolved. The genetic profile has changed. Here's another example. If we look at skin color in humans, we can see that it too is an example of evolution. So humans sort of arose from Africa near the equator. And near the equator, we've got lots of sunshine, which is great because we need sunshine in order to make vitamin D, and vitamin D is important for a bunch of other things in the body. So we're living here, everything's great. We, at some point, developed dark skin or maybe started out that way, I don't really know, but because the UV light would damage the DNA and give us skin cancer. So anybody that had darker skin was kind of protected. Well, then humans started to migrate away from the equator, and they ended up in places up here where there's not as much sunshine. And it's colder. So more of the time is spent with things covering their skin or just not being outside in the sunshine. And that means that we make less vitamin D. So any individuals whose skin became lighter, it actually helped them to make vitamin D because the pigment didn't block the sun from getting in to do its magic to make the vitamin. And so what we saw is that as humans migrated north and adapted to that environment, skin also became lighter. Okay, so another example of evolution. All right, let's move on to more characteristics of life. So the next one is that all living organisms are capable of metabolism. Metabolism means like all the chemistry that you do in your body. And on a practical level, that means that all living organisms have to take substances from the outside environment, get them in, figure out how to break them up and rearrange them, use them for energy or to build stuff, and then get rid of the stuff that they can't use. All of that together and all the itty-bitty chemical reactions that are part of that is called metabolism. All living things show a really high degree of organization. That does not mean that you're really good at staying on top of your homework. What that means is that things are compartmentalized in the organism, that functions are separated. And we see that, of course, at the whole body level because we have different systems that take on different functions. We see that at the cellular level where they differentiate and organize themselves to be able to do different kinds of special things. We even see it in the cell, where different structures in the cell are designated to do different functions that the cell has to get done. So that's what we mean by organized. If I were to look at a cell under the microscope, I'd see clear patterns. If I were to look at a rock under a microscope, it would just be random. All living things are also capable of responding to stimuli. So this is actually called responsiveness. And responsiveness always has some kind of movement associated with it. Now, over here, we've got someone stepping on a thumbtack. The response is going to be this reflex withdrawal of their foot. All right, movement's obvious there. Here we see someone whose pupil is changing size in response to a change in the light in the area. Okay, so there's also movement there. But we also are responding when it's hot outside and we sweat. We don't really see the movement there, but once we look at the cellular level, we can see that what's happening is that cells are moving salts and water in order to produce sweat to cool our bodies down. So there's always a component of movement there. Finally, all living things maintain a stable internal environment despite changes to the external environment. And this is called homeostasis. So obviously this fellow is managing to stay warm. His body temperature is still 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And even though outside, clearly with the snow, it is much less than that. So being able to keep the internal environment stable, even when the external environment changes, that is homeostasis, and all living organisms can do it. One quick word about homeostasis. Homeo means same. Stasis means steady. It's not actually a great word for the process because for anything, and I'm going to talk about this in the next lesson, the values fluctuate over time. When we're maintaining it, we're constantly correcting it to keep it at generally the same level. So it's not a straight line. As a general rule, flat lines are really bad in biology. It means you are no longer living, even if you were a living organism. All right, till next time.